Welcome back to Straw by Science. Dr. Milo with you today with an expert, Dr. Mike Israetel, talking about perception of soreness in training as a means to guide whatever you're doing in the gym, like adding sets, removing sets, doing different exercises. Essentially, how would you use soreness? Would you use it with regards to your lifting practice?
That's a great question. I assume it's in the context of hypertrophy.
Correct.
Cool. So I've explained this a few times, sometimes at length, and a lot of times when I explain it, folks will understand what I'm getting at. And sometimes I think something's kind of lost in translation because I kind of have like it's a little bit more complicated than just soreness means this, soreness doesn't mean that. And so I'll try to explain it in such a way that it's about as simple as I can explain it, but that still conveys roughly what I'm trying to get at. So fundamentally, what really matters is, are you getting stronger for reps over time? And if that's occurring, the soreness is going to be always and everywhere very much secondary to that. So if you're getting stronger over time, I'm not going to kick dicks out of your mouth and tell you like you're doing soreness wrong or some shit like that. Soreness becomes much more of a thing when it has two cases. One is if you're not getting sore at all, and other indicators in your program seem to suggest underdosing, or you just have like the easiest recovery in the world and you're not progressing either at all or at a pace you have come to expect or for some good reason expect to progress at. So if you're not getting sore ever, let's say a quick example, you're training your triceps and they're not big and they are not growing. Your rep strength over time is increasing and you have trouble with kind of generating a mind-muscle connection. So you think there's triceps back there, I'm not so sure. And you're also not getting sore. I would say that whatever amount of tricep training you're doing, and by amount I mean total stimulus, which could be proximity to failure, the degree of effectiveness of your technique, how good your technique is, exercise selection, and the biggest one is training volume. Something there is probably understimulating. And if you also don't get sore, I can tell you, yeah, it's probably a decent idea to try to crank up the stimulus. That brings in the secondary discussion of soreness. If, let's say you train 2 days a week, also triceps, Monday, Thursday, just to keep the shit real simple, and you have delayed onset soreness that lasts from Monday until Wednesday evening or even Thursday morning, and then you have a delayed onset soreness that lasts from Friday morning after the Thursday session all the way to Sunday evening. Consistently, whatever problems you have with your gains, I would proposition that an underdosing of stimulus is highly unlikely to be one of them. Because if you cranked up the stimulus, you would start to get overlapping soreness. And we know that, at least in some methods of analysis, consistent overlapping soreness means you're probably under-recovering, and it means that you're not your strongest at the time of lifting. And yes, some studies on very beginner people where the neurological adaptations outpace everything show that even if you're sore, you can still make strength gains. But I'll tell you this, if you have to do your best in the gym for any one session, do you want to be sore coming into that session or not sore? I surmise that the answer is not sore. And so if someone says, look, man, my triceps aren't growing, I go, do you get sore? And they go, dude, I've never been sore. I'm like, ooh. Outside of the other methods of analysis, I would say it's incrementally beneficial for you to consider that you're underdosing somehow and doing more may be part of the answer. On the other hand, if you tell me like, dude, my triceps aren't growing, and I'd be like, do you get sore? Like, I'm sore all the fucking time. My next guess is probably doing less might be better than doing more in that context, especially if it's regular, not just like your first week or something like that. So that's kind of how I approach soreness, but it can be instructive at its extremes, especially. To put it another way, really quick, really simple, if you're struggling to grow something and you just never have felt DOMs in it, you might want to experiment with some intensification. For example, length and partials consistently make almost everyone that tries them more sore than usual, not just from novelty, regularly for weeks on end. And they seem to kind of fucking work. Cranking up volume will make you more sore, and so on and so on. On the other hand, if you're just getting sore like fucking crazy, you're probably more limited by recovery And training harder is highly unlikely to be a part of the answer.
One final question on soreness before I give my sort of response to that. One thing I think we need to clarify is, what does soreness actually mean to you?
I can answer this in a couple of ways. One is there is a high degree of uncertainty about what the physiological mechanisms of soreness are, and we've known that for a long time. I know of at least one old ultrastructural tissue analysis paper that showed, with analysis of things like Z-line streaming and things, that soreness was much more aligned with a very robust hypertrophic response than it was with a response of pure muscle damage. We also know that soreness arises as a secondary feature, not a primary feature of stimulus. We know it probably has something to do with immune infiltration. Also, and I'm very confident about this, when you take more drugs, you get more sleep, and you eat more food, you get more sore, not less. And if it was just linear damage, you'd be like, but all these things help the damage. How the hell is soreness a thing now? So to me, what soreness actually is at a deep analytical level is unclear. Yeah. But I do know that soreness also correlates with the following things. The introduction of a new exercise or new rep range, when we know that novelty is highly correlated to gains because that's how noob gains work. The noob gains aren't magic. God doesn't know what time it is in your life for training. The novelty effect is the noob gains effect, and it's profoundly helpful for hypertrophy. We know that you get more sore if you get closer to failure. We also know that causes hypertrophy. We know that you get more sore if you do more volume. That causes hypertrophy. We know if you do more eccentric control at long muscle length, that causes more soreness. We also know robustly that causes more hypertrophy. You start to line up all the variables. Here's another thing. In my coaching of very many athletes, especially athletes, volleyball players, soccer players, the people that grow muscle the fastest visually, they get the strongest, that are the more fast fiber oriented, they get robustly more sore than everyone else. Endurance athletes, fucking 10 sets of everything, they just don't get sore. And you're like, all right, well, soreness has nothing to do with growth, no worries. And then they don't fucking grow. Too many correlations for me to just be like, this has nothing to do with anything. So I suspect that soreness is a proxy, not the proxy. And there are other things going on that can even conflate these variables. A proxy for the degree of stimulus introduced. Does that mean stimulus equals growth? No, but stimulus may cause growth.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and by and large I agree that soreness is typically correlated to some degree with stimulus for hypertrophy. I guess the one thing that strikes me in all this, like we agree on most things when it comes to stimulus, when it comes to underdosing training volume or intensity or what have you for hypertrophy, the one thing I struggle with from the research side of things is using soreness potentially as a proxy for fatigue. The reason for that is, as you mentioned, soreness is not a super well understood topic. Soreness is it could be caused by a variety of factors, and a recent review paper, I think, identified about 8 separate factors that could be responsible for the soreness perception.
There's another way of saying we just don't know.
Exactly, like there's just a lot of uncertainty there, right? And that was 3 years ago.
That's a lineup of 8 people who did a crime, and you're like, it could be all 8. Like, wow, excellent. Now we'll get the end. See you later.
Introduce them, and you're like, all right.
Could be that guy, could be that guy. Yeah.
So we really don't understand soreness and how it relates even to muscle damage.
Sure.
And in fact, there's a study by Musaka and colleagues from 2005, I believe, where they essentially had participants perform a very damaging protocol in the biceps with eccentric contractions, essentially creating a bunch of muscle damage, and then measuring markers of muscle damage like creatine kinase, like recovery of performance from before the damaging bout to after the damaging bout, say 2 hours later, 24 hours later, etc. That is probably one of, if not the best, marker of recovery, right? Essentially, the degree of muscle damage induced didn't really correlate very well with how people perceive their soreness.
Did it correlate somewhat with it? Was it
depended on the position. So essentially, soreness was assessed in 3 different positions, like with your arm extended, flexed, and palpated. And there was a few things. One, no matter the position, the correlation between perceived soreness and any marker of muscle damage, whether it was creatine kinase, recovery of performance in a very unskilled test, aka isometric test, the correlation was always about 0.3 or less. So quite a weak correlation if there was one. And more importantly, the correlation of soreness in different positions was also quite low, between about 0.3 and 0.6. So how you assess soreness can also heavily impact how sore you feel. And so if all you're going by in the gym is like, feeling pretty sore, but then some days you're feeling it while you're stretching, some days you're feeling it while you're warming up, some days you're feeling it while you're actually in movement, all of those are different assessments of soreness.
For sure.
And they may not correlate successfully.
For sure. I'm uninterested in what beginners think about how sore they are. I just aren't interested in any perceptual factors beginners have, short of like, I think something broke.
Do you think ability to perceive soreness is something that advanced people get better at, like substantially better?
Yeah, absolutely. Because a lot of beginners can't even differentiate joint soreness and muscle belly soreness.
Sure.
And so you really don't know what the fuck.
I mean, we don't know anything about this from the research side. Could be true, could be not true.
Totally, I
just
suspect that it's true.
Yeah, I'm open to that possibility. But I just think specifically as far as using it as a metric of recovery, I think performance in the gym should be by far the primary one. And at this stage, I don't think we have, anecdotally, we may have some evidence like, hey, when I feel sore, sometimes I don't perform well, what have you. But from that study specifically, there was actually a positive correlation between soreness and performance. So people who were a bit more sore, if anything, performed a little bit better. And that's in line with some research suggesting that soreness is more indicative of the remodeling process than it is of damage. So damage occurs instantly when you exercise. Soreness seems to be more so delayed, indicative or indicating that it is more in alignment with the remodeling process from damage than it is actual muscle damage and disruption to the muscle.
I've been saying that for about 20 years.
Yeah, man.
I got something right. But doesn't that also highly implicate soreness and a probability of being associated with growth? Isn't soreness like you're still growing and recovering and remodeling? If soreness is implicated as a symptom of remodeling, why are you in the gym training if you're still remodeling? Is an interesting question to ask. Now, there could be like, well, look, like overlapping remodeling curves are totally fine. I'm open to that idea. But maybe if you waited a little bit and then hit it again when you were healed, maybe it would be all good to go. I'm not sure about that. But I think especially the extremes, it starts to make sense. If you're so sore that you're clearly not going to lift as much as usual, maybe it's time to back the fuck up a little bit and wait a little bit. If you're a little bit sore, I just don't think it's a big deal either way.
Yeah, I see that. The one thing I'll come back to, and now we talk about the research a little bit, is experientially, when I am sore, that doesn't consistently predict how I perform. If I'm cripplingly sore, like for example, I once did a session from the Ennis study, the 26-set session, where they were doing 52 sets of quads a week. I did that essentially unprepared. And my God, I hit unfathomable levels of soreness.
What would you peak in soreness? So 3 days later?
Instantly.
Oh, you got ions.
It felt like it was instant. Like it was like I was sore for 6-7 days maybe.
6-7 days. When was the worst soreness? What day?
Honestly, it was
a blur.
If I had to rate it, and that's the issue with rating as well, it's like it may not be consistent or reliable, what have you, but if I had to rate it for the first like 3 days, it was 10 out of 10.
Yeah, amazing.
From like 2 hours, maybe an hour even onwards, I remember not really being able to walk properly for a few hours.
Yeah.
It was incredible. For sure. But anyways, outside of extreme circumstances, I haven't found that a perception of soreness is really indicative of how I perform in the gym. And to me, because performance in the gym is the best proxy for recovery, because it essentially incorporates a lot of stuff, right? Like it incorporates, are you psychologically ready? How damaged are your muscles potentially? All of that stuff, like more central factors and more peripheral factors. If soreness doesn't predict performance, I'm inclined to, or consistently in sort of day-to-day normal contexts, I'm inclined to say it may not be the best predictor of should I be training, how much?
It's definitely not the best predictor of that. But I would also say that if soreness seems to be more and more linked in literature as part of the remodeling process, for sport athletes, like if you're sore, shut up, go on the soccer field, nobody gives a fuck, you're not going to break into pieces, you'll perform just fine unless you're crippled. But if your goal is hypertrophy, and remodeling is clearly still robustly occurring, as evidenced by soreness, why not just take more time off? Or next week, when you do the session again, do 4 sets instead of 6, so that you can have an area under the curve of remodeling that ends relatively close to your next session.
The issue I take with using soreness essentially as a means to individualized training is that we don't know a ton about soreness, and we don't even have super clear evidence on exactly whether or not remodeling is the growth response either. Like there's going to be differences, right?
So there's a recovery remodeling response
for sure,
and a tissue aggregation.
Exactly, like Dama studies, right?
They could be very linked, as the Dama studies suggest, or they could be pretty different in some contexts.
Or they could occur over different timelines. There's a variety of things.
100%.
It's really not a well understood area of research. And so my contention or my issue with this stuff is, are we using soreness and pump and other experiential variables as a means to auto-regulate or individualize training, but potentially moving things in a direction that isn't optimal, right? Because if we have now, I think, 20 studies on volume or close to it, And sure, they work in averages, right? So they can only really inform us well about our starting place. But still, because they work in averages, the average responder in the study will be somewhat similar to the average responder in the real world. But so if we're using these variables to say, all right, let's move your volume for chest from what we think is going to be quite effective, based on literature, say 15 to 25 sets a week for your chest, and you're getting sore. And we use soreness as like a very strong predictive factor of stimulus or recovery. And we're like, look, you're still sore 3 days later. We need to reduce volume, or if it's overlapping soreness. If that then takes us from 15 to 25 sets, which is what we've empirically derived to be a solid place for most people, and we take that down to say 8 sets, from empirical versus rational perspective, I tend to identify more with the empirical side of things. Because in these studies, we're actually measuring growth from manipulating the variable of interest. So it's the most direct research there is. So if we're using an area of research or a variable that we don't understand fully yet, and we're doing it at the expense of this variable we've tested empirically quite a few times, I fear we might be actually reducing muscle growth. And that's where the real risk of using soreness or the pump or these variables that aren't fully understood yet really arises to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
What's your general thought on that?
My general thought is you could have a situation in which the averages make sense, but the averages could be optimized even more if you let individuals guide themselves through soreness, which we don't have any data to prove against. So the average growth can be good even when some people get overlapping soreness. But if you designed a study which you auto-regulated via soreness responses, we could find out later that everyone gets better growth. The people that can recover faster get more volume. We already know people who are recovering more easily, to increase their volume, they do better. It's if people have trouble recovering, and the soreness versus recovery thing is a bit tentative, then maybe they can do less and benefit. We already know that the standard deviation of optimal volume within any given study is quite large. It's not like everyone is somewhere between 17 and 14 sets. Very, very large deltas on that. So maybe soreness can help guide us. Another thing is, at the beginning of a program, this compelling reasoning that you just gave. As you work through a program, you just don't get sore nearly as easily, and then your ability to float into the muscle hypertrophy ranges that are really, really overall quite optimal is pretty much unabated. I mean, you could just keep adding sets for a while and everything's all good. So I use soreness in 2 ways. I use it at the extremes, and I use it as one of the decisional variables on top of all of the others. So like with the RB hypertrophy app, for example, if you tell it you have psychotic, go right now, right now, I need money, I don't see money. If you tell it, like, I'm getting super fucking sore still from last week, it'll reduce your volume and the next time that you go around, but you can always just hit the plus sign and add a set. We never disable that function. At the end of the day, if you're like, fuck it, I'm sore, but whatever, I don't give a fuck, we're like, hey, maybe that works. So really, it's just a matter of after the first few days or weeks of a program, you may be, the amount of volume it may take to get you really sore probably starts to line up with the volume recommendations that we see generally in the literature. Now, at first in week 1, soreness comes really easily, but I would also contend, based on an interview I did a little while ago with PAC, that easing into a program so that you never get the psychotic soreness also has its advantages as well. So that's kind of how I see it.
Cool. I think we agree by and large. I think what it ultimately comes down to is, one, maybe differences in minimizing type 1 error rate versus getting that potential benefit, which as a coach, it makes a ton of sense, right? Even if something doesn't have all of the evidence behind it yet, but there's a potential benefit, like lengthened partials, for example, I tend to think it may be worth incorporating, right?
Totally.
As a practitioner.
For sure.
But from an evidence-based perspective, it may be a little bit different.
Totally.
And that's totally valid as a way to operate within the gym.
100%. What I like to do is I like to take the empirical evidence as the foundation for things that are very likely correct and very likely incorrect. And then I take more heuristic variables like soreness and pump, and I layer them on top of that. And if they can give me incremental hypothetical margin of more intelligent decision making, I'll use them. But I won't use them if they violate the underpinning variables. But most times that doesn't happen with people. Sometimes it does. And then a lot of times you have to seek a little further clarification. Like, tell you this, like, I'm familiar with one gentleman I consulted with recently who has been getting sore from 1 or 2 sets for like 4 or 5 days at a time. And it's been getting more intense, even though he's been training for months and months. I legitimately told him to go see a doctor, because like that is a very unusual Have you ever seen that in practice? Like you train up and then you're getting more sore.
Yeah.
And the volume it takes to get you sore is full. I've never seen that in my entire
Exactly.
life.
And that's the thing,
bad
right?
news.
That's the thing, right? Like we don't fully understand what factors contribute to differences in how people perceive soreness.
For sure.
It's a perception of soreness versus actual muscle damage, and the jump from one to the other can be
Totally. And I will say this: I have never tied my card to the horse that says soreness equals muscle damage. I always thought that soreness was more indicative of secondary immune infiltration caused muscle damage, but that's not the same kind of muscle damage as primary muscle damage. And it's less muscle damage, but more like the immune system cells actually unzipping the various parts of the muscle cell and starting to fix the shit.
Yeah.
And that's what it seems like is occurring. Here's another piece of compelling secondary tier evidence. Anti-inflammatory drugs cannot possibly interfere with muscle damage. The fuck Superman drug, you can't break your muscles, they don't do that. But if you take high doses of NSAIDs pre, during, and post, you get a huge decline in delayed onset muscle soreness and also a decline in hypertrophy.
same with cold water, isn't it?
Cold water.
Yeah.
You know,
This can sound like they're like blood flow and all
totally.
that. You know.
But once about 8 out of 10 variables line up to soreness and growth point in the same general direction, I gotta think like, man,
It's
not to it.
It's soreness, but also muscle damage. So in this case, NSAIDs literally reduce inflammation on the physiological level,
Correct.
but they also happen to reduce soreness, right?
Yes.
I agree that that's some evidence in favor of the two going hand in hand, but it's important to acknowledge whenever we discuss them, obviously, we're giving advice to people ultimately. We have to be somewhat practical.
Sure.
But I think just on a framework level, we always have to be like, okay, let's distinguish the two a little bit.
These are all educated guesses,
Yep.
and they're all highly imperfect.
For sure.
Yeah.
Hey man, it was beautiful.
I love it.
If you like the video, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned. Peace.